Thank you so much, y'all. I want to start off by just saying, not a PhD candidate, not these amazing researchers, but a public school teacher. So the question ran through my head when I was making this presentation being, what can I provide for y'all to make this as meaningful as possible in this next hour? And the number one thing that I really want us to take away from today is a lot of what was said in the last presentations, which is all of us with our students or with eventual patients have goals. And how can we backwards design to make sure that we are achieving and assuring that we are achieving those goals along the way? And the method I'm going to talk about today is called universal backwards design, which is all about starting with these goals in mind. All right, so as Alex introduced, my name's Weinstock. I was a founding member of Columbia's team for instructional and pedagogical support 4 to 5 years ago, where I did a lot of trainings with teachers, including Alex, and did a lot of coaching and one-on-one support to build their curriculum and engagement in their classrooms. All right, I'm also a high school teacher. I teach 9th and 11th grade English. This is my 11th year of teaching. And yeah, big takeaways I want for today. And I'm going to go over this at the end too. But if you could take away 3 things for today, it is number 1, what I said already, being that starting with your goals, your patient, your course goals, whatever that might be, and having that anchor your study is the most important thing. Because I noticed so many times when walking into classrooms, so many times when looking at syllabus and curriculum, that a lot of people are throwing together lesson plans or throwing together patient goals without thinking about the larger goals that we're trying to achieve. So number 1 thing to keep in mind, I keep trying to look up there, it's impossible, is start with your goals. Number 2, and I'm going to differentiate between these 2 things, is building skills, not just content. A lot of classrooms that I go into, I'm hearing a lot of facts mentioned, but very little application of that. Very little analysis of those skills. So I'm going to be differentiating between what skills look like versus content and why it's so important that we are making sure that we're building those skills as well. And then last thing, not to force planning. As a teacher myself, I have days where I'm like, I need this lesson plan for tomorrow or next week, and I push through it and I create a lesson plan that might not be as aligned to my goals. And instead of doing something that could really support my students or my patients in that way, it actually really takes away from it. And it does not lead towards my learning goals as a result. I also know that these are all 1, 1, 1. That is not on purpose, but they are all equally important. So it works out in that way. All right? So my learning objectives as a teacher, I'm always going to have learning objectives, and we're going to talk a bit about them throughout this, is that by the end, you are able to apply these principles. And it's actually funny, because when I was talking about this with Alex and discussing this, how I came up with these learning objectives, I thought of 2 clear things. Number 1, I want you to walk away understanding that essential skills and knowledge are defined based on your larger goals. And number 2, that your course or patient objectives reflect mastery of those goals and the content that you are assessing. And it's funny when we were talking about this, because I actually did change this verb to understand, right? Because again, if we're really thinking about what our larger goals are, for today, I do not expect everyone to walk away and apply this immediately to whatever content or course you might be doing. What I am hoping that you can leave with is at least understanding these principles. And the reason I'm making my thinking really clear here now and showcasing this change is 2 things. Number 1, it's okay to make these changes. And number 2, you should always be searching for, as you develop your plans, what am I truly assessing? And what is it I need my students or patients to walk away from at the end of this class, at the end of the semester, at the end of the week, whatever that might be. All right, so I'm going to go through 3 things today. Number 1, just what is universal backwards design? Number 2, the first stage of backwards design. We'll finish with a Q&A. I'm also going to provide a lot of resources at the end if you're really interested more in also daily lesson planning, engagement, whatever that might be. I have 5 slide decks that you can also use. All right, so what is this term that I keep talking about? Universal backwards design is curriculum design starting with the end in mind, right? Before I start planning my daily lessons, before I think about what texts I am going to bring in, before I think about what project my students need to complete, I think about what do they need to show to me to showcase mastery of my course? What are the goals that I need to set for my students to assess them along the way so that I know when they leave my course, they've achieved what I've set out for them, right? So it's taking away this mindset of thinking day to day and thinking much larger picture. And for me as an educator, I learned this in my my graduate, and it took me years to put into practice, probably around 5 or 6. But at the point where I am now, every single thing that I do, from a do now in a lesson to a week's worth of plans, is anchored to my ending. Every single thing that I do, all right? The second 2 stages are measures of learning, which is assessments, right? That's where we get into our projects, quizzes, exams. And then last, which is a bit counterintuitive, is your daily lesson planning. Again, I will be providing resources related to stage 2 and 3. We're really gonna be discussing 1 today, all right? And why should you use it? Twofold. Number 1, for instructors. For myself, I have a much clearer idea going into every single day what I need to accomplish. Because I've already thought about how my daily objective is going to lead to my weeks-long objective, which is leading to my course goal. And I am able to take out a lot of unnecessary info, and when I am discussing this with my students, I am able to be a lot more focused in my questioning and my tasks for them, right? So number 2, my daily lessons, like I said, are super aligned to my end goals, which leads to my last point, being that as instructors, it's so much easier to plan once we think this way. Because I'm able to just start by saying, I know what my end goal is, so Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, we need to do this in order to get to Thursday and Friday, right? Because the way I used to plan was a lot more, I really, as an English teacher, love this text. I want to bring this text in. These are the skills this text discusses, so I'm going to do that. Rather than being, this is my larger goal, so I'm going to purposely bring this text in, that's fine, but the skills that I am assessing maybe are student questioning, right? For students, a couple things as well. Students receive the course that a lot of us as professors in this room promised our students, right? If we've written a course description, if we have a syllabus that goes out to students and lists objectives, I know at the high school program I work at, the number 1 complaint I get from students is, it was not the course that was promised to me. This assures that this is the course that is promised to you because you are constantly thinking about how to move that forward. Second thing for students is it helps them have a much better understanding of where they are as a student, right? Self-assessment is something I can do in my class all the time because my students know what the end goal is. So they can assess themselves along the way to make sure that they are eventually reaching that mastery. And last point with this is, as an instructor, I am also able to pivot a lot easier, right? If I notice that there is a misconception, I know that I need to stop for some of them that are so necessary to achieve my larger goals, and others I can stamp out quickly and come back to at the end. But as an instructor, I'm much more easily able to pivot based on data that I receive from my students from assessments. All right, so I'm going to talk for a second about learning goals, aka course objectives, or if you're working with a patient, your patient goals, right? I have a template that I'm going to share at the end that can be really helpful in providing this, all right? But first stage, that 1A stage that I talked about, has 2 steps really here, right? Number 1 is to annotate your course description or your course goal, whatever that might be, for necessary skills that students need to achieve by the end of your course and knowledge that they need to gain, right? And then creating those objectives. So let me show you what that looks like, right? When we're thinking skills, we're thinking things that are transferable. We're thinking analysis that you're going to use in every single course you ever do for your entire life. We're thinking about annotation of a text, which I know a lot of us are reading case files. We're thinking about things like motor control movement, which was told to me by Alex. I am not a physical therapist. I don't know this info. But that is a skill, all right? Close reading. Things that are going to show up in every single content that you ever do, ever. Second thing is now the knowledge. This is the content that is specific to your course. As an English teacher, these are things like literary elements that when you get into physical therapy or you get into the sciences, do not connect. But those skills still do. There is still close reading in every single subject that you're ever going to do. There is still annotation in that way. All right? So again, this circles back to what I said before, where the first thing we need to do is identify those 2 things. Because I find that a lot of teachers are identifying just that knowledge piece. And then when they ask students to apply that knowledge, there's a huge disconnect in that way. All right, so the slide's gonna have a lot of highlighting, underlining here, but this was myself taking Alex's course and doing this exact work. Right, so I'm just gonna quickly read this. It says, understanding the philosophy of exercise in humans is essential to the successful practice of physical therapy. Not only does it give therapists a frame of reference for understanding exercise and sport-related injuries, it keeps going. I'm not gonna read the whole thing. But skills that I was able to pull out from this, as someone who's never taken this course, is number one, annotation. Students are interacting with text. Number two, fitness evaluation. That seemed to be the largest goal of this course. Number three, data analysis. Four, application of when to prescribe certain activities, when to develop sound practices for those people. And then finally, I found the highest level skill, which again is going to show up in any course you take, is evaluation, analysis, and revision in that way. All right? The knowledge that I saw that was unique to just this course, or might have been a through line for a specific content, was physiology, exercise and sports-related injuries, neuromuscular and musculoskeletal disease, cardiovascular and pulmonary disease, right? These are terms that students need to know. But on this left side over here, these skills are things we really need to think about and teach and model for our students to assure that they are able to apply these things and not just memorize terms in that way. All right? So now we're at the point where, because we have annotated that course description, we are now able to think about, what are the actual goals of my course? What are going to be the objectives of my course, right? So two things to really think about, actually three. Number one, measurable. The number one thing you really should think about when you are planning your course objectives is this measurable? Is this something I can actually get a data point on? Right? The two presentations before me had such a clear research question that they were able to assess the answer to because it was very measurable. There was a clear answer to it, or clear data that at least it could provide for you. Second thing, is it achievable? A lot of the syllabi I read have 10, 15 objectives. It is way too many. There is no way that you can reflect mastery of 10 or 15 objectives over a certain amount of time. Obviously, over years, that could be done. But my main piece of advice is 5 to 7. Obviously, that is going to change, right? Per course, and there might be some wiggle room within that. But when we're thinking about our course objectives, the reason I say 5 to 7 is we're thinking about higher level skills here. We're thinking about evaluation. We're thinking about application. We're thinking about analysis. We're not thinking like I can identify or define a specific term. That could be a daily objective. That could even be a weekly objective, but it is not an overall course objective, right? And finally, I'm going to talk about this one in a little bit more detail, is that it includes one actionable and accessible verb, because that comes back to the measurable point, being that how do I measure this is by choosing a verb that students can showcase to me to show mastery of whatever skill that is. How many of us in this room have created objectives before or worked with them before? Incredible. I'm guessing most of us have used Bloom's then, and Bloom's taxonomy. Awesome. So if you haven't seen this before, really this is what a lot of teachers and instructors have relied on for years to create objectives for their course, assessing them. If you're a student in this room and you've copied down a learning objective or an aim, I'll bet you any amount of money you have seen these verbs over and over again. All right? And if you're someone who really likes using Bloom's, continue to, right? The way it's structured really is starting with knowledge, like we talked about in the beginning, at the bottom, and moving all the way up to evaluation, analysis, and application, and synthesis in that way, which again, I'm arguing is much more skills-based and not as knowledge-based as we see at the bottom here. What I discovered as an educator a few years ago is something called the Hess Cognitive Rigor Matrix, which I started to use a lot more. And the reason I use it a lot more are twofold. Number one, it is specific per content, right? So this one that I have up here is for health and physical science, but they also have one for speaking and listening, for reading and writing, for physical fitness, for math classes, for fine arts classes I've seen, social studies. I really love this because it's a lot more particular for my content. Second reason I really like it is this knowledge piece on the bottom. A lot of instructors would argue that this could be a level 3 or 4 because it could be really difficult for students to understand a very complex idea. And yes, it is related to knowledge, but it's still an extremely complex idea, especially in our maths and sciences. So what I love about this is if you notice on the left side, it has those Hess verbs, but it will extend them to a level 4 so that you're able to use and identify, but at a much higher level in that way. I also want to say, there's a lot of words on this page. When I first started looking at this, it was kind of intimidating and pretty difficult to use. But I'm going to show us in a sec how I really zoom in to be able to create objectives using this resource, right? So the one I showed before was physical education. Like I said, there are a million. The one I'm going to really focus on today is this math and science piece. All right? So I'm just going to back up one sec. At this point, we've thought about step 1A, right? I've pulled out the skills that were related to Alex's course, the knowledge that was related to his course right over here. And now I am going to choose to use and apply those skills and knowledge to create, I'm only going to create 3, but 3 course objectives for his course. All right, and I'm going to do that using the Hess Cognitive Rigor Matrix. All right, first 2 objectives that I always create and that I suggest that instructors create are knowledge-based. These are the content that you want students to master. You want students to take away from your course, right? So for me, if we look back at this Hess Cognitive Rigor Matrix that I was using, I really stuck in the remember part in the top left corner, right? And I chose the one that was all about recalling facts, right? And I thought back to the knowledge that I already pulled out for him, which was related in physiology, exercise and sports-related injuries, neuromuscular and musculoskeletal diseases. And I created the objective, recall facts, imperative 2, and I started to list those things. And again, that is one course objective, but these are maybe the 3 to 4 pieces of knowledge that you think are essential that your students or your patients walk away with. All right? I also always ask myself as I'm creating these objectives, how am I going to assess this down the road? What is that going to look like? All right, and like I said, that's a later stage of universal backwards design, but if you're someone who wants to build curriculum using this, you should be thinking to yourself, how am I assessing it as I create these objectives? All right? Number 2, now that we get to this point where I was able to assess that knowledge and build an objective over that knowledge, now I am moving up in difficulty. And now I'm starting to talk a lot more of the skills and applying the knowledge in that way. All right? So I always ask myself for my 3rd to 5th learning objective, what skills do students need to master in order to show me that they have mastery of my course and can move on from here, right? So same idea that I did with the Hess Cognitive Rigor Matrix. You could have chosen any of these verbs, I would say in the 3rd or 4th box there. I chose to go really far here, and I said conduct a patient case study analysis that specifies the problem, identifies possible solution paths, solves the problem, and reports results, right? Because for me, that is a direct application of the knowledge that they have already learned in your class. Through this objective, which might be in week 3 or 4 of your course, I'm able to now assess, number 1, did my students learn the material they needed to? And then number 2, are they able to show application and mastery of that knowledge in that way? And if you're thinking in terms of patients, what I might be thinking about here is I was someone who tore 2 ligaments a year and a half ago, and with my physical therapist, this was things we talked about, right? I learned the exercises, and then by week 3 or 4, I was able to properly do those exercises and be assessed on how I am doing them. And then my patient course was revised based on my recovery, based on how I was doing, understanding, and working through that. All right? And then finally, I come to what my final assessment is going to be. What is the last thing I am going to ask my students to do in order to show mastery of my course? And when we think back to the way beginning, the course objectives that I set out for them and the course description that I had originally written, right? So for this one, I chose to go way far to the right for synthesis. And I said, gather, analyze, and evaluate patient information, modifying factors to develop a sound program of exercise, training, wellness programs, and physical rehabilitation for your semester-long patient, right? So again, this is the point where this is the last thing that I'm asking students to do that will properly assess, did they actually achieve mastery of my course? I also want to be really clear, like I said before, I suggest 5 to 7 learning objectives. Yours might be more based on what your course is and what it is you need to assess, or it might be less in that way, all right? But again, this process really took us by starting with what is the necessary knowledge I need students to gain, what are the necessary skills I need students to gain, and building our objectives based on that. Also notice that I have not one time thought about a daily lesson plan just yet. And the reason I haven't thought about a daily lesson plan is that's something I will build after. Once I complete this portion, I now have my goals anchored, and now I can start to think to myself, cool, week 1 is gonna look like this, week 2, 3, and so on. All right? Like I said before, there's a lot of resources that I am able to provide y'all if you're someone who is interested and wants to continue thinking and learning a lot more about this, all right? So I want to talk about a few of these. This universal backwards design template is just a template that I created and use a bunch in order to make sure that I am always thinking about my end goals before actually creating my daily lesson plans. Path to your final project or assessment, we talked about this way in the beginning, but that second step of backwards design after I've created my course objectives is to now think about how am I going to assess them? What is that final project going to look like? What do students need to show to me or my patients need to show to me that they have achieved mastery? Third thing that I have there is then rubric design. Because so many of us are creating these great assessments, but there's a lot of subjectivity that goes into that grading. And it's really important that we are creating rubrics that are anchored to the skills and knowledge that are necessary that students need to show us that they mastered that course. So I've also attached a slide deck for how to do that. All right? Lesson plan template, that's finally when we get to that daily lesson planning. And then the last 2 that I provided are just a lot more based in teaching for that day, right? Do nows and checks for understanding is a lot more based in the engagement for that day. And then finally collecting and adjusting to data, right? That last piece I talked about in the way beginning, but as I'm thinking about how my students progress throughout their goals, I also want to be thinking about how do I need to adjust curriculum in order to match my students, meet them where they are, and support their growth towards my larger learning goals. I do know that all of these resources will be provided right outside through a QR code. And I want to just bring us back to these 3 goals, and I'm going to have a good amount of time for questions. Being number 1, start with your end goals in mind and let those drive and anchor your planning, either working with patients or teaching a course. Number 2, build skills, don't just cover content. Really think, what are the skills that my students need to develop throughout the way in order to master this content? And then finally, don't force planning. If you are really struggling to plan one day or work with a patient, it is so important that we zoom out first instead of stepping right in and getting something done when it's not your best work. All right? Alex, I know I finished a bit early, but thank you guys so much.